Mikhail Bulgakov worked on this luminous book throughout one of the darkest decades of the century. His last revisions were dictated to his wife a few weeks before his death in 1940 at the age of 49. For him, there was never any question of publishing the novel. The mere existence of the manuscript, had it come to the knowledge of Stalin's police, would almost certainly have led to the permanent disappearance of its author. Yet the book was of great importance to him, and he clearly believed that a time would come when it could be published. Another 26 years had to pass before events bore out that belief, and The Master and Margarita, by what seems a surprising oversight in the Soviet literary politics, finally appeared in print. The effect was electrifying. End quote. That comes from Richard Pevier in the introduction to the 50th anniversary edition published by Penguin in 2016. Welcome to the Deep Dive Book Club. This is Leo.
I'm Joel.
And we are so glad you're joining us for our second part of our discussion of The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov.
We're going to continue going on from where we started, which was talking about Yeshua, Matthew Levy, all of them, and Leo. From the cold open that we had from the 50th anniversary, why did Bulgakov fervently write a novel whose very existence was a danger to his life? Why was it so important for him?
I have some theories. Do you have any?
I thought it was because he was expressing the oppression and the censorship of dealing with the Soviet Union at the time, the oppressive government, the totalitarian control, and the reduction of creativity, art, and authenticity.
Very much so. Very much so. Along those same lines, for me, it seems that he was a true artist and he was truly conveying something onto the page that was moving him, that was for him something larger than himself. You know, it was more important than his personal safety. He had this work of art that kind of gripped him, and he wrote it out for 12 years, writing this novel very purposefully and painstakingly. And so he had something that was more important than the danger he faced. True artist. It also makes one wonder, was the book eventually being published in oversight by the Soviet censors?
I'm not sure. I don't know if it was an oversight, because it clearly is attacking them, but not in a overly satirical way where you could easily tell that, because it was a story within a story. There were themes around it, but it was magical enough to where it wasn't a direct attack on the government itself. And there was also no direct attack to any particular individual. It wasn't like we see satirical cartoons now where a particular leader or person is depicted in a humorous way.
Can't do that in Soviet Russia, or at least not for very long. Can't get away with it for very long. I think you might be onto something. It's the mix of fantasy and the dreamlike quality of the novel itself that maybe gives it a protective fog that has the implicit criticisms kind of guarded against by censors. In my head, I have probably too cartoonish of an image of a Soviet censor who's in charge of reviewing materials and deciding what can and can't be published. And, you know, the level of fantasy and absurdity that happens in the novel is that protective layer that the censor just doesn't have the ability to penetrate past. You know, he's too much of a bureaucrat to see past that level. It's like, oh, this is just silliness. Okay, it can pass. It can be published.
I mean, especially with people like Joseph Stalin really enjoying his works, so it probably got some credence just based on that, and with how popular his playwrights and everything else was.
True. Joel, any more thoughts here on Soviet censorship and, you know, the burning questions that had to be answered through Bulgakov's writing?
No, let's get right into it.
Okay, let's talk about Chapter 3, The Seventh Proof, where Berlioz goes to make a phone call to get the authorities to come deal with a seemingly insane professor. Recall last time that in Chapter 1, Wolin inserts himself into the conversation of Berlioz and Ivan Homeless, and then Chapter 2 is just Wolin telling them a extremely detailed narrative about Yeshua and Pontius Pilate. So he goes to make this phone call. Berlioz, on his way there, never makes it. He accidentally gets his head chopped off by slipping and falling on tram tracks, dying exactly like the professor predicted. As Berlioz was walking away from the bench where Holmes and the professor sat, the professor urgently asked him to believe in the devil and that Berlioz would soon see the seventh proof.
This urgency on the part of the professor seems to be because he knows Berlioz is about to die in the next few moments. So why is it important to the professor that Berlioz, a man moments from death, should believe in the devil?
That is the question that jumped out to me when reading that. Like, why does the professor care so much about, this soon-to-be victim believing in the devil? And it's a head scratcher. I never came up with a satisfying theory on this one. Joel, do you have any thoughts on this of why Wolin's like, hey, guy who's about to die in 30 seconds, you really should believe in the devil?
I have no idea.
Could just be humor. It could just be in there for humor. And there's a lot of humor throughout this novel. And another thing that the scene, makes me wonder is, did the professor predict Berlioz's death? Did his prediction cause the death somehow? Or is he just, oh yeah, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to insinuate myself into this situation here because it's convenient for me. What do you think?
I thought it was just because he predicted it, since Yeshua is the opposing symbol and he can predict things. And now we have Wolin, the devil, who can also predict things as part of a supernatural power.
Kind of a symmetry, a mirroring. I didn't think about that. And I did not think about that. So he's just displaying, hey, I've got the supernatural ability like the guy in the story I just told you.
Right. That's what I thought.
So you don't see any thread of causality between Berlioz getting his head chopped off by a tram car and Woland. Woland's just saying, hey, here's what's going to happen.
I thought it was just, here's what's going to happen. I can predict the future.
Yeah, I can see how an argument could be made that it was the act of prediction that helped push Berlioz over the edge to be uncomfortable enough, in combination with his wild Pontius Pilate story, to, okay, I need to go make a phone call right now. I'm a little disturbed and I'm not really paying attention. Whoop! Slipped on some oil and the head's cut off.
Sure. Yeah, I could also see that.
So, Joel, let's tackle the question of what is the seventh proof. Back in the first chapter, Berlioz and Ivan are talking about how God doesn't exist. When the professor walks up and butts into their conversation, they mention the 5 proofs, which I looked it up is a reference to Thomas Aquinas' Proofs of God's Existence. And the 6th proof is Immanuel Kant's. And the 7th is Wolin's himself.
What do you mean Immanuel Kant's? Immanuel Kant's writing?
Immanuel Kant wrote a 6th proof in response to Thomas Aquinas' proofs. So they're adding it up to be 7 when Wolin adds in his 7th proof.
So if we were to go through those proofs, we have the 7. Oh, it talks about Thomas Aquinas right here on this hyperlink. Wow, look at that. So if we were to go into the existence of God, the first one, what is this one? This is the argument around the unmoved mover.
In Latin, Thomas Aquinas called this ex motu.
Aquinas said that things move, so something or someone, an unmoved mover, from whom all motion proceeds, must therefore exist.
Yeah, because everything's in motion, there must be one single centrality that is the cause of the movement, and that mover must be unmoved. Therefore, the movement proves that God exists. This is proof 1 of Aquinas' 5. The next one is the argument of first cause, in Latin, ex causa. Some things are caused by something or someone else, therefore there must be an uncaused cause of all caused things. I like the application of grammar and semantics to, universal reality here. I think it's very creative on Aquinas' part. So because everything had to have an originating point, everything had to be caused, then there must be a cause of all causes. Therefore, that is God. That is proof of God. What's the third one, Joel?
The third argument is of contingency. Many things in the universe may either exist or not exist. Such things are called contingent beings. But it is impossible for everything in the universe to be contingent. Therefore, there must be a necessary being whose existence is not contingent.
That one I don't really understand when I was reading through it. Do you understand that one?
Everything must exist or not exist. I assume that he means human beings, insects, animals, all of those things are contingent beings. It almost sounds like a combination of the first two, where there's an unmoved mover or there's a causer of causes. So there is something who can't be contingent. Like, we live and die. Therefore, there must be something that doesn't do that.
Okay, fair enough. I like that interpretation. So the fourth one, and this is probably my favorite when I reviewed these, was the argument of degree, or ex gradu. Various perfections may be found in varying degrees throughout the universe, which assumes the existence of perfection itself. So because we can see various gradations in perfection, that implies that there is an absolute point to which all of these things are infinitely approaching, which is ultimate perfection, which to me is a theme that stands out in Dostoevsky's The Idiot that we will happily be talking about in a future podcast episode.
I would love to talk to him about what he means by perfection, because in many ways, some things just are. They just exist. They are how they are. So one leaf is not more perfect than another leaf. That's an arbitrary, subjective relevance that we give it because we can just look at it.
Not to Thomas Aquinas.
Right.
And I see, a lot of influence here from ideas like Plato's world of forms. There you can easily see that there is a ultimate abstract triangle from which all other triangles derive their triangleness. So very much in that same thought here. Okay, Joel, what is Aquinas' fifth and final argument for the proof of God?
All right, we got the argument of design. All designed things have a designer. The universe is designed. Therefore, the universe has a designer.
Seems to be very much in line with the first three.
Right. Yeah.
And then we have Immanuel Kant, who comes in several centuries later and adds a sixth argument. And here he says that his argument is called the argument of the moral order. Kant said that we are rationally obliged to attain the summum bonum, and what we are obliged to attain must be possible for us to attain. So if there is no God or afterlife, it is not possible to obtain the summum bonum. So God or the afterlife must exist. For me, this reminds me of our discussion of burnout society, where because everything is possible, you must try to do everything. You must try to achieve because it is possible. And so it becomes like impelling. You're impelled to do so, and you would only be impelled to do so if it were possible.
Sure. Yeah, we got that. So we see Woland asserts the existence of the seventh proof following Kant, which is demonstrated to Berlioz minutes before he's decapitated. At least believe that the devil exists. I no longer ask you for anything more. Mind you, there exists a seventh proof of it, the surest of all, and this is going to be presented to you right now, in which I think he's just referring to death.
So you think he's referring, hey, you're going to die, and that is a proof of God?
I think that is what that means.
So for me, what I got out of it is that the seventh proof is that, hey, I am proving to you that the devil exists. And if the devil exists, then therefore God also has to exist. And he's proving the devil exists because he's saying, hey, I'm predicting your death and you are about to die exactly how I said. And I am this mysterious professor of dark magic. Hey, on your way to your death, make sure you believe in the devil because you're about to see some proof. So that's what I think the seventh proof is.
I could see that.
Fascinating chapter. And, this is just another cranking up of the notch of supernatural events that occur, sitting on top of the foundational reality that these poor characters are subjected to.
Yeah. If the devil exists, God must exist too.
That's Woland's proof. Fun that Bulgakov adds that in.
That is fun. I just figured death is the final proof, or the seventh proof.
I can see that interpretation. Joel, any other thoughts you have here on the seventh proof and what Woland's up to?
No.
All right. Well, Berlioz lost his head, and let's talk about how Ivan Holness reacts to this.
In Chapter 4, The Chase, Ivan Homeless is in shock and mentally unstable because of the sudden, macabre death of Aurelius and the sheer surrealism of the professor's supernatural knowledge and predictions. His two accomplices, a man described as long and checkered, and a large sentient cat. The checkered citizen is Kroviev, who is also described as appearing like an ex-choir master, which I don't even know what that means.
I have no idea.
He is also referred to throughout the novel as Fagot or Fagato.
Right. I believe that is close to the correct pronunciation. I'm just going to refer to him as Fajot, even though that is not the correct pronunciation, just because the correct pronunciation of his name sounds too much like a slur in English.
Another fun connection to the Russian language, Kroviev, is similar to the Russian word for cow, which is korova, which may allude to the biblical golden calf in materialism. Bassoon. Wow. We also see that his other name, Pajot, refers to bassoon, reflecting his tall and thin physique.
And then for the cat, named Behemoth, I just want to read the description straight from the book just because it's fantastic. You ready, Joel?
I'm ready.
Okay, quote, "The third in this company proved to be a tomcat who appeared out of nowhere, huge as a hog, black as soot or as a rook, and with a desperate cavalryman's whiskers. The trio set off down Patriarch's Lane, the cat walking on his hind legs." End quote. I just love that description. I love everything about Behemoth when he's on screen. It's just immensely hilarious and entertaining.
Behemoth is a fun character.
So Ivan tries but fails to chase down these three, and the fact that he even tries, I think, is evidence of his increasing instability. In the process, he loses clothes. He causes a huge disturbance at a restaurant called Griboidev's, which we'll talk more about, which gets featured more in Chapter 5. And he ends up in a mental clinic, which we'll talk about in Chapter 6. So a few things for us to talk about here. Joel, what do we think of Homeless's breakdown and actions here? Has he snapped, or is his behavior just trying to assert rationality into the irrational situation he finds himself in?
I thought the author was just representing a character who, when faced with the supernatural, then responds in a confused manner, as we all would.
Right. How else would you react to this weird happening? If you and me were sitting on a park bench and we're having a deep conversation, and this very mysterious figure comes up, literally inserts himself in between us on the park bench and says, "Oh, hey, you're going to die in this particular gruesome way here in a few minutes, and you're going to end up in a mental hospital." And then tells us a wild, crazy story from the ancient past as if he were there, and then stuff starts happening. I mean, Ivan is probably reacting better than I would.
Yeah, I thought it was just capturing the human spirit and how people would respond to it.
Something that jumps out to me from the crazy chase itself, Ivan Homeless steals a large candle and an old religious icon that he actually hangs around his neck. Joel, symbolically, what do we think these items might represent? Did these jump out to you in any particular way? Were they saying anything for you?
I just thought Bulgakov was representing when we're faced with irrational things or faced with death, we hold on to old religious symbols or old religious theologies as a stone to grab onto in this whirlwind of existing as a human.
I like that image of a stone to grab onto. For me, I was thinking along similar lines. The religious symbol is maybe even Ivan struggling with his atheism. He is, staunchly atheistic, and he's writing a poem about atheism, and he wants it to be even more atheistic because he's going along with what Berlioz is saying, like, hey, no, you're writing this poem, but you need it to be even more atheistic. And now he's confronted with this supernatural being and this vivid story of Pontius Pilate, and so he can't help but lean more towards believing in the supernatural, believing in the religious, mythical symbolism. And so he, like you said, he clings to a religious symbol here, despite declaring himself atheistic.
Basically, through the novel, we see every single character is subjected to chaos and turmoil, all seem to be coming from Woland or his associates. Behemoth is one of the main ones I see. As we learn in Chapter 5, at the restaurant, it's a luxurious restaurant, and it functions as the headquarters for the Masolit,
I believe, I don't know.
which is the writers' union. The pattern suggests that the professor, and therefore Bolnikov himself, is specifically targeting the Moscow literary circle. What do you think he's trying to say here?
He had to deal with critics and a lot of, viciousness in his time dealing with the literary inner circle, especially because he did have some success and he was dealing with censorship and the regime sticking their nose in. So for me, this is just Bulgakov getting his revenge in literary format and also poking at the kind of self-importance that the literary circle was giving itself at the time.
I thought the whole scene was, like you said, just to make fun of the writers at the time, because everyone is pompous in the restaurant. It's not...
Yeah, everyone's full of themselves.
Yeah, everyone is not really intellectual or valuable. People are just, pompous, I guess is the best word I have for it.
And a little inauthentic. There's something very bold about Bulgakov portraying the writer figures besides the master in, as kind of almost spiritually weak. And again, I don't mean that necessarily religiously, because Bulgakov didn't mean it religiously, but we'll see a little further on a poet named Ryukin that will come up, and he's a really good example of, someone who's just artistically or spiritually weak, or can't be a good writer specifically because he's not being authentic. And I think Bulgakov, while he is getting satirical and literary revenge, he's also employing a heartfelt criticism here of, no, if you're going to be a writer, you need to take it seriously and you need to put more heart into it, which is super bold of a writer to do. But hey, he understands his own power and capabilities. That's something he is very aware of. And that's something, that you see in figures like Dante Alighieri in his writing. He inserts himself into, biblical levels of writing, and he puts himself in the story as a character on the same level as ancient pagan poets and writers. And so he understands his own place. He has a sense of his own place and power within the literature tradition. So I think Bulgakov is following that same way. And for me, and I'd love to know your thoughts, Joel, it seems like this pattern of poking at and having a good laugh at the literary circle is also a pattern that implies a wider commentary on the Soviet system itself. The Mazolit has this luxurious restaurant as their headquarters, and they have all of this. It's almost corruption because they have all this access to resources and luxury goods that the common person doesn't have. And, it's kind of it's hypocrisy because, everyone's supposed to be equal in the Communist Party, but, if you're part of the inner circle, you benefit a little bit more.
It could be. Maybe it's a wider commentary. I thought it was mostly just poking at writers, because even in the Soviet Union itself, different groups of people have different access to certain luxury goods because it's supposed to help them accomplish certain things. Basically, what you put into the system, you can then acquire back from that. But maybe it could be.
Yeah. So we'll circle back to a few more things from chapter 5 and 6, but how about we jump into chapter 7, titled A Naughty Apartment. You ready to talk about this one?
Mm-hmm.
So in this chapter, we learn that almost all the dwellers in the apartment building where Berlioz lived have mysteriously disappeared. The reader is also introduced to a character named Stepan Bogdanovich Likodev, who is mostly called by the diminutive Styopa. Stepan shares an apartment with Berlioz and is also the director of the Variety Theater. And he's introduced waking up with a severe hangover to find Wolin waiting in his room, reminding him of a contract to host 7 black magic shows. Despite his memory loss regarding the agreement, Wolin's retinue, including Behemoth, Koroviev, and Azazelo, confirms the contract's validity and subsequently teleports Theopa to Yalta to vacate the apartment for their own use.
Yalta, for fun, is 1,100 miles south of Moscow.
So, Joel, let's talk about the apartment building and its occupants and how they seem to be subjected to a kind of intertwined combination of being haunted, directly being targeted by the professor, and victim to the infamous Soviet disappearing. So we, as the reader, learn that, just in the time leading up to Wolin's visit, everyone in the building, there's people just kind of mysteriously disappear. Like, this one person, went on a walk with the policeman, and both he and the policeman never came back. Was one of the disappearings. What do you think about that?
I thought, one, on just the surface, the professor just wants to use the apartment, so he makes it easily available for him to use the apartment. And then the rhetoric, or the message behind that, is just the Soviet Union disappearing people. I don't think I saw anything else other than just those two aspects of it, the surface and then the social commentary.
The implication, yeah.
What else did you see? What big fish did you catch on your hook?
I did like the kind of haunting nature and imagery of the descriptions here, because again, there's the ambiguity, the fogginess, and that adds to that mysterious nature. Okay, and that mirrors, like you're saying, the social commentary of people disappear and you never get answers. If someone's disappeared, you're just never gonna know. They just never show back up, and it's even taboo to talk about it, like we talked about in 1984. It's very much the same thing. If someone gets disappeared, you are endangering yourself by even bringing it up and talking about it. So follows the exact same pattern. And the ambiguity there is how much of it is Wolin, how much of it is just the Soviet system, and is the way in which Wolin is doing it is the Soviet system. And it's all ambiguous. And that foggy ambiguity, I think, is very much on purpose and gives it that dreamlike, and in this instance, nightmarish quality.
It does seem to have that nightmarish quality, and we can see, I think, that echoed in, 1984 and other dystopian-style novels like that. It's all very concerning. I think the companions, though, add the comic relief of Behemoth being very humorous, the idea of the cat walking up on two legs, people seeing the cat. All of this is good-natured fun amongst all of this much more dark and satirical writing that surrounds the actual events.
And with, teleporting Lekodev and disappearing everybody in the apartment, it makes me wonder, okay, is the professor a force of destruction? Is he representing some kind of justice? Because he seems to be wanting to face reality, and he seems to be one of the only characters to actually face reality the way it is, but then he does all these things. Like there's kind of like a solidity to Wolin that most other characters in the novel don't have. And while he is very trickster-like, he also seems to be, very straightforward and truthful. So I'm grappling with, what is he as a force representing? And that just brings me back to the epigraph, the line where he's a figure who, quote, eternally wills evil and eternally works good. Do you see that, Joel? What do you see with, just the sheer chaos and craziness that surrounds Wolin like a whirlwind that everyone gets caught up in?
I thought it was just a representation of being human, especially in the Soviet Union. There is just a whirlwind of chaos represented here. Because I don't think it's a theological statement.
No.
But I do see it as an existential statement.
And so, for you, you're seeing Wolin almost as like a anthropomorphization of that chaos, where here's a figure that can more easily represent and give us something to grapple with the chaos. Yeah.
Yeah. We love anthropomorphizing.
That's what we do.
Species.
Joel, anything else you want to talk about here in this particular section?
No, I think we hit it pretty well. Let's take a break.
we are back. Joel, let's talk about the character Ryukin. In Chapter 6, titled Schizophrenia, as was said, Ivan Homeless is taken to a psychiatric clinic accompanied by a poet named Ryukin and several others. Ivan is, very unstable. He's tied up and he's verbally abusing everyone for wrangling him and preventing him from looking for the professor. But amongst all this verbal abuse, he continually singles out Ryukin for the worst of the abuse. He even denounces Ryukin, calling him a kulak pretending to be a proletariat, which is a dangerous thing to say in Soviet Russia. On the ride back into the city, Ryukin is troubled by his visit to the clinic and the thought that he was not and would never be a good or famous poet. He reflects that, quote, glory will never come to someone who writes bad poems, end quote. And he follows this by asking what makes his poems bad, to which he provides the answer, quote, I don't believe in anything I write, end quote.
Makes him a bad poet.
Ryukin seems to be kind of a representative of the criticism Bulgakov's saying about the inauthenticity of writers during his time. Is that how you see Ryukin? What interpretations do you have of this character and what he may represent?
Bulgakov was just getting his shots in against writers and poets, especially at the time, that would capitulate to propaganda and write things they didn't believe in.
Oh, that's a good point. You're right. From the overview we were talking about, he just, didn't give in to writing propaganda.
Yeah, I didn't see anything deeper than just taking shots. But I would love if you caught a fish of something to pull us down.
Well, that's part of authenticity. I think we're saying the same thing, just from different angles. You're saying, the successful writers of the time were ones that were willing to, bow down to the regime and write the stuff that they wanted them to write. They were to write propaganda. And that's a form of inauthenticity if they didn't believe it. They're just paying lip service, literally, to the regime, and they're betraying their authenticity. They're betraying their art form by putting propaganda above saying something artistically true and real. So I think we're saying the same thing, just from different angles. Or do you disagree?
No, that sounds about right to me.
I mean, we could disagree. We could find something to argue about. Like I said, the listeners, love hearing a good bloodbath.
Let's see. Why is Homeless being the angriest at Ryukin?
Why do you think he's singling him out the most?
I think because Polnikov knew a poet that he was mad at.
Oh, you think he's supposed to be an actual figure from Bulgakov's life?
From the reading in the restaurant and this, it sounds like it's an overall commentary, but also it seems like he's really mad at certain people.
That's another parallel we can see in Dante, right? In Dante's Inferno and his Divine Comedy overall, where he has no problem with calling out contemporaries or recent contemporaries. He's oh yeah, this guy's a bad ruler, so he ended up in this particular punishment in hell. And I think Bulgakov is in a very similar way calling out contemporaries, and he may be veiling it behind thinly changed, characters and appearances, but very much so calling out contemporaries.
So how do you feel about Ryukin's reactions and his reflections?
I think the perfect picture of this is when he looks at a statue of Pushkin and he says, oh, that guy was just lucky. He's right on the verge of having an authentic understanding and realization that, oh, I don't believe anything I write, and connecting that with why he's a bad poet. And he's bemoaning the fact that he'll never be a good or famous poet. And then he sees a statue of Pushkin, a literary hero to the Russian people. And he's like, oh, that guy was just lucky. He comes right up to the edge of coming to some sort of realization, and just like, just gives in to jealousy, envy, rather than accepting a hard truth.
That can be tough. And I think sometimes people aren't strong enough to see their flaws. People aren't strong enough to see the lack of originality, like we can see in Dostoevsky's The Idiot, where one of the characters, and we'll get into it when we do that episode, but one of the characters is like, well, I know I'm not smart enough to be original. I know I'm not smart enough to be authentic. So let me just be, or not smart enough to be original. So let me just be me. And in some ways, that's a much more intelligent way to approach that than what we see here with Ryukin, who can't accept the authenticity of who he is and therefore has to make up excuses for his shortcomings.
Yeah, I like that.
I'm sure there's a better psychological way to approach this in terms that would relate or mean ego guarding. And we can see this throughout literature, movies, but also in real life. I know people that I've seen in my personal life that do a lot of ego guarding.
The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, we could see that Ryukin here is constructing his own personal hero mythology to protect himself and set up conditions so he doesn't have to face his shortcomings. You know, Pushkin is not someone to be emulated because it's too scary to emulate such a towering figure. So it's easier to set up the mythical narrative like, oh, that guy was just lucky.
And so with that, Leo, I think really a lot of people would do something similar to Ryukin, where they're like, oh, this other person's lucky, or this other person was just born with more money, all of this stuff. And that's an excuse for your own mediocrity.
That reminds me of the tendency for people to sometimes mistakenly choose what their goal or mission is by defining not what they're for or what they're trying to pursue, but what they're against or what they're trying to tear down. And it's just so limiting to like have so finite and exterior defined mission. In the short term, that works out really well. Let's say like a company, for example. A company who's making it their mission to tear down their competition. Like, we're going to get ABC Corp, and that's very finite, and that's a finite game that they're playing with a definitive end. And when they get that, then, unless they quickly changed tact or mission, then there's kind of an emptiness, a wondering, a bereft nature, because they're missing their core mission. But if their mission is something a little bit more broader view, then they can pursue that endlessly. And so here with Ryukin, he is kind of limiting himself by setting up this false version of other people's success and setting up success as just it's a game of luck. And then he gets to participate in a very small, finite game and not pursue the greater and harder path, but potentially more rewarding path of authentic pursuit of art and who he could be as a poet.
Sure. I think there's plenty of books and poetry about someone doing exactly what you talked about, but in the terms of getting revenge. If that's their pursuit, they get the revenge and then they are empty. They are hollow afterwards, because turns out that having this destructive or hateful goal, once you reach its end, it doesn't produce anything. There's nothing left for you to have. It's not promising. And I think most of the times authors are pointing at, if your goal is destruction, removing the other company, or revenge, you're going to end up being a hollow person afterwards.
And to tie it back into the novel overall, I think that hollowness is really what is fueling the chaos whirlwind of Woland that Bulgakov unleashes on his pages in Moscow. Woland is, forcing the hollowness and the emptiness and the inauthenticity to be confronted. Like, hey, this is corrupt. This is not the way you need to be doing things. Like this, you're being inauthentic. You're not facing up to the truth. And Woland is the force of like forcing people to see that, as we'll see in the black magic shows, and as we'll see in all the crazy stuff that happens. He is, him and especially his minions, and like you said, especially Behemoth and Koroviev, are destructive and poignant, and we'll see here with another character soon. They're forcing people to deal with inauthenticity, and there's got to be a great paucity and lack of authenticity in Bulgakov's time when he's writing this, because you literally have to choose between survival or being yourself. You often can't do both. So survival in the Soviet regime, has to come at sacrificing parts of yourself. And what happens to a person, what happens to a neighborhood, what happens to a city, when that's the system that you live under, when you have to sacrifice who you are and your authenticity just to keep going. And so I think that hollowness, that aching hollowness, is what he is pursuing here by this novel and in the character of Woland. And of all the figures that come across the page, we haven't met, and spoiler, we won't meet the Master and Margarita until book 2. We won't really get into them until further into the novel. And they're the ones who are supposed to be representing, in my opinion, authenticity as it's meant to be. The Master unflinchingly writes an actual good novel, and it can't be accepted by all these hollow people, and they tear it down, and they refuse to recognize its worth. And that's what authenticity has to deal with in this system, in this world that Bulgakov's in. And then, like you were saying, the ultimate message here for this book might just be that, yeah, truth can be suppressed for a time, truth can be put down for a time, but it will win out in the end.
Let's move on to Homeless, who's one of the fun characters we get to dissect as he enters into the clinic, Leo.
Yeah, let's catch back up with Ivan Homeless. So the events in Chapter 8, which is titled The Combat Between the Professor and the Poet, takes place in that mental clinic and involve Homeless's interactions with the staff. The clinic is described as white, shiny, bright, clean, and technologically advanced. Dr. Stravinsky, the head of the clinic, is portrayed as a very rational and orderly man. He tells Homeless that he is free to leave, and at the same time talks him into staying at the clinic of his own free will because of his abnormal behavior. Joel, I think part of the humor of this chapter is the deference and awe the characters give to Dr. Stravinsky. And if you're okay with it, I'd like to read how he kind of first appears to the reader. Or would you like to read it?
No, go for it.
Okay, quote, "Unexpectedly, the door of Ivan's room opened, and in came a lot of people in white coats. At their head walked a man of about 45, as carefully shaven as an actor, with pleasant but quite piercing eyes and courteous manners. The whole retinue showed him tokens of attention and respect, and his entrance therefore came out very solemn." End quote.
Ivan mentally compares Stravinsky to Pilate. Another motif that occurs is Ivan continually being awed by Stravinsky's intelligence. This plays out by Ivan saying something, and then Stravinsky repeats it back to him, the last thing he said, but puts it in question form. This makes Ivan feel heard and understood, and that the doctor really gets it. Finally, someone understands what I'm trying to say about the professor.
So the voice of reason, finally.
As an example, Ivan gives a rambling, slightly unhinged recounting of his misadventure with the professor and tries to chase him down and get him arrested to prevent further mischief. And the only thing that Stravinsky replies is, quote, go ahead.
"So you're trying to get him arrested. Have I understood you correctly?" Yeah, Ivan's just awed by this figure. And Stravinsky just seems to be repeating back to him what he said and sounding reasonable.
How do you feel about the clinic, Leo? We see this white place, we see the cleanliness, we see technology, we see all of these people in white coats. What do you think about this?
My mind kind of goes several different directions on this one. And again, I'd love to hear your viewpoint because I think you're going to take it a different direction. But for me, the emphasis on the cleanliness and the whiteness and the orderliness and the cutting edge technology is to kind of contrast with the drabness of the Soviet system and the drabness of what Moscow was like under the Soviet system.
Sure, I could see that. Yeah. The architecture definitely reflects a type of bureaucratic efficiency without any characteristic or art connected to it. I don't necessarily correlate that to the cleanliness that we see here in the clinic, but I don't have anything deeper to pull from it.
Right. For me, it kept getting emphasized. White coats everywhere, white everywhere, cleanliness. It was constantly called out in this chapter. So let's talk about Dr. Stravinsky as a character himself. How accurate do you think Ivan's assessment is of his intelligence? Because I'm of two minds of this. What What is your mind of?
I don't think Ivan understands his intelligence. I think it's just a humor. It's just a way of poking fun at this. This is part of the humor of the book, where he thinks he's intelligent just because he's repeating what he said.
Right. So Stravinsky could be like a silly straw man figure of like, oh, well, we're giving the leader deference, and isn't he intelligent? And even though he's not really saying anything. So it could just be humor for the sake of humor, because this whole episode is very humorous. Or, it could be, if I am digging a little bit deeper, and again, please disagree, the kind of emptiness of Stravinsky's intelligence is maybe poking fun of the kind of cult of personality that can easily develop in the system that Bulgakov was in. A bureaucrat gets enough, power in the bureaucratic hierarchy, and then suddenly they're given a deference and a gravity that doesn't fit their shallowness or ineptitude whatsoever. Not to say that Stravinsky comes off as inept, but he just doesn't actually do anything that demonstrates, in my opinion, intelligence or high degrees of reason. Does a great, masterful job of just repeating back what Ivan says to him. But other than that, I don't really see any evidence.
I feel like Stravinsky's intelligence isn't portrayed in any way, whether positive or negative, whether he is smart or not. I think we're just seeing it from Ivan's perspective of, oh, he repeated what I said. This is great. He knows what he's talking about because they said what I said. So I don't know. I feel like I couldn't, if this was like a paragraph and I had to answer questions, I don't think we have any information on Stravinsky's intelligence.
Fair enough. Well, that's where I go with it, is that, like you, there's an empty space, a question mark there on his intelligence, and Ivan is awed by him just because of his trick of just repeating back what he says. And maybe the whole interaction and silliness of it is humor, and maybe as a commentary on cult of personality that can develop, or too much importance being given to people who don't deserve it. So only other thing I wanted to talk about this chapter was the contrast between the title, which as a reminder is the combat between the professor and the poet, and the scenes that play out. So here, I'm assuming that the combat between the professor and poet is talking about Professor Woland, but when glancing back through this chapter, most of the time Dr. Stravinsky is called a doctor, but Ivan at one point, I think in his head, calls him a professor, like, oh, Professor Stravinsky, blah, 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 blah. So originally I thought it was interesting, like, oh, this is talking about the battle between the character we've been seen called the professor throughout the story, but actually maybe this is just simply referring to a kind of battle between Stravinsky and Ivan.
I could see that. I mean, that's very possible. Maybe it's a combat in between Ivan and the doctor. Maybe there's some unrelated themes where Ivan is combating the professor because he wanted to chase him down, but now he's in the clinic and he's lost the battle, so to speak.
Right. Professor Wolin is nowhere on the page in this chapter, and this can maybe be seen as if the word professor in the title is referring to Wolin, then there's all kinds of implications there that maybe Ivan is doing battle with the version of the professor in his head, the kind of apparition that's left over from his experiences with the professor. Or I could just be completely wrong, and this is, in fact, referring to Stravinsky and the poet, and they undergo a kind of verbal diplomatic battle where Stravinsky just hits him with rhetorical questions and reasonableness and convinces Ivan to choose to stay in the clinic.
I don't see any other reoccurring themes that pulls back to Woland or anyone else in this clinical setting, except that we see maybe Ivan himself when he talks to the doctor, he doesn't really mention his poetry. He doesn't talk about his poetry. I think that's because he sees Ryukin, and he himself starts questioning his own merits and abilities because he had the atheistic poem that he was talking about at the beginning. And maybe all of this kind of culminates into him thinking about his own life and his choices and potentially the inauthenticity of his own work. So maybe Woland was just pointing that out, that he's just wrong. And he's dealing with that as combating in between who he is or who he's pretending to be, and Woland pointing out his authentic self. Or it's just Ivan the doctor. I don't know.
And again, this could be ambiguity on purpose, or I could just be missing something. Joel, anything else you want to talk about there?
No.
Okay, I'd like to jump to chapter 9. And this one's titled Koroviev's Stunts. It opens with, quote, Nikanor Ivanovich Bossoy, chairman of the Tenants Association, where the late Berlioz used to reside, had been having the most terrible troubles, starting from that Wednesday night, end quote. And we learn that Bossoy is a kind of minor bureaucrat, and his position is one that is generally hated. He's in charge of housing decisions, and it's a position that is often seen as corrupt. And there's no appreciation for people who are in this position.
When Bossoy checks on Berlioz's apartment, he meets Koroviev, who introduces himself as the professor's assistant. Koroviev talks circles around Bossoy and convinces him to let the professor rent the rooms for a week with an outrageous sum and to take a bribe. This is another chapter full of humor, an example of the kind of verbal whirlwinding that Koroviev unleashes on Bossoy, and can be seen why Bossoy is rightfully very suspicious of Koroviev when he finds him in the apartment that is supposed to be empty and asks him, "Are you an official person?"
To which Koroviev answers, Hey, Nikanor Ivanovich, what are official and unofficial persons? It all depends on your point of view on the subject. It's all fluctuating and relative, Nikanor Ivanovich. Today, I'm an unofficial person, and tomorrow, lo and behold, I'm an official one. And it also happens the other way around. Oh, how it does, end quote. And the whole chapter is like that, where Koroviev is just running circles around him verbally. A lot of fun. And another thing to kind of point out here that I caught on the second go through was that Bossoy never introduces himself, and so Koroviev is continually mentioning his name, twice here in what I just read. But the very first interaction with him is he calls out his name. So he's further confusing and befuddling Bossoy because this stranger knows his name, knows his exact name, and it says, Nikanor, huh? And so that's like if you never met someone and it was a weird situation and oh, Joel, nice to meet you. Let's let blah, 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 puts him off balance and keeps him off balance.
Maybe you can take us deeper in, but the whole event seemed like a humorous poke at bureaucracy, the housing shortage, the political environment that destroyed the capability for housing, and then mocking the level of corruption in bureaucracy because of the lack of resources that was available. Bossoy being the representation of all bureaucrats at this mid-level that are bad at their job and would make you feel like you're sitting in line at the DMV.
Yeah.
Corruptible, bribable, and of low intelligence.
Yes. Thankfully, in our country, the version of this we have to deal with every now and then is limited most of the time to the DMV, or Department of Motor Vehicles, for those of you who may blessedly not know what that is. It's our little version of this type of bureaucratic incompetence where you wait in line for mundane paperwork that is tedious, and there's large stacks of it, and you never know why you have to do this or that or other, and the process is always changing, and it's always poorly explained. It's the perfect example of bureaucratic hell.
And I think part of it is also Bolnikov pointing out the use of bureaucracy in the way that Woland and his associates use the bureaucracy to their advantage. Well, you have to go through it. You're the bureaucrat. You control all this stuff, right? And all the other tenants, everyone else, no one says anything because of this bureaucratic system that in some ways is just arbitrary and gets in the way of people being able to just live their life.
Yeah. I think your assessment's right on the nose that this is another bit of revenge on Bulgakov's part. And this little bureaucrat right here in this position that's, infamous for its corruption and ineptitude. Let's all enjoy a moment here of poking at this type of bureaucrat. In our, milieu, it would be a DMV, someone, a mid-level DMV bureaucrat getting what's coming to him. Wolin. I would love for someone to write the story of Wolin and Azazelo and Koroviev and Behemoth going to the DMV and just wreaking havoc. I think the satisfaction that we would get out of that is the satisfaction that writers who are people who are subjected to this type of bureaucrat would get out of this.
Especially with what happens to Basoi.
Right. So Koroviev, is winking and nodding and elbowing Basoi the whole time, and he's like, hey, buddy, I'm going to pay you a lot of exorbitant money. Here's a bribe for you. And then as soon as Basoi, is shooed out of the apartment and gotten rid of, from the other room, we don't even see him. The Wolin says, I don't really like that guy. Can you make sure that he never comes back again? And Koroviev says, you just only have to ask for it. And he goes over to the phone, uses his supernatural powers to assume the vocal identity of another tenant nearby, and informs on Basoi to the secret police about the bribe that he just gave him. Then he kind of forced him to take. So, which makes me wonder, because it does seem like Koroviev goes out of his way. Why does he go out of his way to tempt Basoi? Basoi was originally like, oh no, I don't want the bribe. I'm just here to figure out what's going on with the apartment. And Koroviev just kind of almost foists it on him.
I thought it was just the humorous jest by Bolnikov.
Could be. Could just be for humor.
What do you think? Why does Koroviev not only tempt him in what we would call entrapment nowadays,
right,
but continues to intellectually run circles around him? It's not just bribing. It's bribing and mocking him to the point where he doesn't even know that he's being mocked.
Right. Yeah, because he like almost weaponizes politeness. He's like, like aggressively shaking his hand. He's like aggressively, being deferential and polite and blah, 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 blah. Just doing all these hyperbolic acts of politeness that get used in a form of attack. I don't know. It could just be humor. There could be a little bit of social dance going on that we're not privy to. There may be something cultural here of this is just the dance that happens when it comes to bribing an official like this, where they have to do a bunch of like, oh, no. So there's plausible deniability, but I don't know.
Like certain cultures, if you're offered a certain thing, you have to say no a certain number of times until it's socially acceptable to accept.
And I don't know if that's what's happening here or not.
I don't know. In Persian, it would be tarof, or what I Englishifies as tarofing. And they also do the same thing when they speak English. They call it tarofing, which just means you are saying no to something or saying yes to something only to be polite, and the other person is expected to push against that a certain amount until you capitulate.
It's a social dance that you just have to do.
Yeah.
Another thing I think we cannot pass up, Joel, is the beautiful phrase that Koroviev brings up, or whenever he's having Basoi count out the exorbitant and embarrassing large amount of money. Joel, you love this phrase. Tell us about this phrase.
Cash loves counting?
Yeah. I've heard you say this phrase multiple times since we read this book.
Wow. And then the other one is, your own eyes won't lie.
It's just, that's the peak of for me, it's the peak of the humor in this chapter, because he's sitting there. He's got this guy befuddled. He's got this guy counting out the money. He, kind of forces him into everything. And in the middle of the counting, he's like interrupting him and like literally elbowing him. And like, cash loves counting. Your eyes won't lie.
Wow. He is having fun. With all of this jesting at poor Basoi, eventually he gets tattled on. And I think later on,
he gets hauled off.
Yeah. He gets hauled off and all this stuff. So do you feel like he deserves what happens to him?
Just from what we can see in the chapter, it's arguable that no, he probably, it's unclear whether he deserved or not. But from what we know about his position and the types of people in that position and how they used their authority or misused it, that he probably did deserve it.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it was a social dance. Maybe Kronikov did work hard to convince him. Maybe that was just a way of removing an obstacle because they wanted to be in that apartment. Okay, let's take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll finish out this section with Chapter 10. All right, and with that, we are back. I'm so excited. Leo, aren't you so excited? We're going to get into Chapter 10, a long chapter, if my memory serves correctly, but a powerful chapter nonetheless. Take us in, Leo.
Okay, this chapter is titled News from Yalta, and we know who is in Yalta right now. 1,100 miles away from Moscow. He got there by being teleported away because he was too annoying for Professor Woland. So, Stepan Likoidev, the director of the Variety Theater, sends desperate telegrams from Yalta to his colleagues at the Variety Theater. Remember, he is the director of this said theater. In Moscow, Veronuka, who is the theater administrator, and Rimsky, who's the financial director, grapple with Stepan's disappearance and the bizarre telegrams, initially suspecting a prank or drunken escapade. And that's a good guess because he starts off as being extremely hungover when he shows up in the book. And so they're confused. The chapter goes through this confusion, and it just continues to escalate when Veronuka is sent by Rimsky to investigate the situation and this weird disappearance. But he's ambushed by Woland's assistants, namely Azazello and Behemoth, who beat him up. Like, hey, you didn't listen to the phone call where we were warning you not to dig into this. And so they just beat him. They pushed him against the wall and beat him. And then, he's disoriented and he stumbles along and he ends up being confronted by a terrifying female figure who gives him a kiss that makes him black out. And the reader eventually learns that the vampire-like female creature is named Hela. She's portrayed as cold, icy. She's often naked and very scary. Another, fun thing, Joel, tell us about the telegrams, the super lightnings.
So from what I remember of the telegrams is we have Veronuka and Rimsky, as long as I'm pronouncing those names correctly. Yeah. They're sitting together and they work in the theater as well in different aspects, but they get a telegram, and let me make sure I don't get this wrong. I got it. Because there's 3 telegrams. I just want to make sure I get them in the right order.
Right.
So they get a telegram from Styopa, and he is in Yalta, and they're confused because he asks them to send money.
Right. And he was just in Moscow, and there's no way to get to Yalta that fast. They just saw him recently.
Yeah, they saw him recently, and they got a phone call from his apartment from him just last night. And so they're like, what? He's so far away. This is a prank, blah, blah, blah. But I think they decide to send money just in case because they think he's drunk. And then they get another telegram, a super lightning, which when it's translated, we get the information that it's a super lightning telegram. And in Russian, apparently, they just say super lightning.
Because they would know what that means.
Right. And it's basically, the second one is him warning them, I'm really in Yalta, I need help. Watch out for Woland, this and that. They're like, no, there's no way. And then I think humorously, they're like discussing how could this be? Maybe he's in Yalta and that's the name of like a bar that's just outside of town.
Like, what is he talking about?
And they're like, he's definitely just drunk. And then I think the third and it's funny because the lady that brings the telegram, who's clearly part of the supernatural gang in some aspect, is like, oh, hey, this just came. And it's like, oh, no, don't. You have to believe the first telegram, right? Because somehow Styopa immediately figures out that they don't believe the first telegram or whatever, and it's clearly this supernatural, funny, humorous combination. And I can just envision the movie or the play where they're in the middle of talking about the first telegram,
and the
lady comes.
Keeps like butting in.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to read something from masterandmargarita.eu, which anyone who's interested in this book, this website is phenomenal. Whoever put this together did it, with a lot of love and a lot of juicy, great information on here. So this is a bit of insight to help me understand this. Quote, in the Soviet Union and certainly in the Stalin era, it was common to portray the realizations of the state organizations and thus the telegraph services as well in an exaggerated and positive way. Bulgakov didn't have to change much to parody it. Superlightning was only a little step more than the term lightning, which is really used by the postal services to describe a telegram. So instead of, just calling it normal telegram, the hyper positive spin propaganda about it is superlightning. And that's just typical Soviet humor to point out, this is just hyperbolic language to say, look how great of a system we have, even when it's mediocre at best.
I think the whole chapter is very humorous. I think it's very fun. They're like deducing everything down, but I think it also, again, starts highlighting Roland and his gangs like playing with people and having their own humor. I was trying to understand Hella as a character. Leo, what do you think? What does Hella represent? Why is Hella there? Is she just comic relief in a scary supernatural way? Is she supposed to represent something? What can we connect this to?
She, for me, while she's naked and there's some like sensuality there that's portrayed, it is in a uncanny way. Like for me, even though she's like naked in the scenes, she is very much portrayed like she is vampire-like. She is basically a vampire. She's portrayed in a terrifying way where it takes what would be sensuality and makes it horrific, makes it terrifying. She is scary through and through, even though there are some humorous bits that we'll see with her, as with all of Wolan's assistants. And so, what she does is he gets beat up, which is rough and bad. And what's worse, though, is when Hella, this red-haired woman, walks up to him and is naked and says, let me give you a kiss. And he blacks out. So the way that sequence is portrayed, at least from my reading, it was much more scary than these two lunatics beating the guy up. Like, that seems like it would be better to be dealing with than Hella, the way she's portrayed.
How bad do you think Veronika and Rimsky are treated in this chapter? Because they are also a part of the theater. They work there, and this chapter really, they're at the forefront of the pranks by Roland and his companions. And they're using Styopa as like this connection. And
right.
So, I mean, are they poorly treated? Do you think they're being abused? Do you think they deserve what's happening? Do you think they're just the butt of the joke for Roland?
Yeah, I think they just end up being part of the butt of the joke. More than most of the characters, they seem to be collateral. They seem to be collateral. Veronika and Rimsky, they kind of go in two different directions. Like Veronika steps in it and keeps stepping in it. And then we'll see later on that Rimsky is maybe the only character who gets off lucky, because he takes the situation seriously and reacts to the supernatural in a believable way and just gets out of town. He literally just gets out of town, and so he kind of avoids some of the worst stuff that happens to people.
It's hard to blame him. Be like, nope, I'm just going to nope myself right out of this situation.
Yeah, we'll see that in coming chapters. That another bit of humor where, Veronika, the poor guy, he's just trying to do his job, investigate what's going on, gets beat up, has to deal with a scary vampire lady, and then Rimsky's like just nopes right on out of there.
The way that you put that, maybe that in itself is its own. Is Bulgakov giving a moral lesson that maybe sometimes the right answer is to just leave, see how this character avoids all this other problems. And in a way, one of the things he does do, as we'll see with other characters, is he removes himself from the supernatural issue and he doesn't have to go through further trials. So other characters, and especially the audience, has to go through further trials because of their greed. So their greed leads them to being in another situation where they're in a moral dilemma, which leads to another situation where they're in a moral dilemma. But like you just pointed out, it just made me think of it, where Rimsky at the very beginning decides, no, I'm getting out of there, but he doesn't realize that that decision also removes him from further moral dilemma situations.
Right. Yeah. It's highly inconvenient that he, has to abandon his post at the theater, and he's upheaving his situation, but he still, he gets out.
Yeah. and in some ways not related to the book.
And that's the only character I can think of that makes
that
it out.
gets off with any good portion of it, except for
Right.
Roland having his fun.
Right.
And that makes me think of East Germany and West Germany, which is not related at all to this book, but leaving your area right before the Iron Curtain falls down to escape that totalitarianism. Not that they knew exactly what was going to happen to them anyway, but what a choice. What a choice to be made.
Yeah. Joe, I'd like to read, the last paragraph or two here of the chapter so we can really get a sense of the change in tone when Hela appears and just the kind of scary vampire-like quality she brings to the scene. Sound good?
Yeah.
Okay. Quote, "Here the two robbers vanished, and in their place there appeared in the front hall a completely naked girl, red-haired, her eyes burning with a phosphorescent gleam. Veronica understood that this was the most terrible of all things that had ever happened to him, and, moaning, recoiled against the wall. But the girl came right up to the administrator and placed the palms of her hands on his shoulders. Veronica's hair stood on end because even through the cold, water-soaked cloth of his Tolstoy blouse, he could feel that those palms were still colder, that their cold was the cold of ice. 'Let me give you a kiss,' the girl said tenderly, and there were shining eyes right in front of his eyes. Then Veronica fainted and never felt the kiss." End quote. So, naked red-haired woman shows up and it's immediately not sensual. It's inversion of sensuality, and the inversion of it is adding to the horror. And he immediately knows just from her supernatural presence, like, oh, this is the worst it could be.
Love that. Love that. That is great. What a great chapter. This was a funny, fun chapter. Are there any other deeper philosophical meanings that we could derive from this? Or from Hela, the character?
I mean, that last little bit, that very last line where, he never felt the kiss is, if I had to dig around for deeper symbols there, it would be that in itself is like Tantalus, like the Greek figure Tantalus, who's subjected to be eternally hungry and standing under a tree full of fruits and food, and it doesn't matter how high he reaches, the tree pulls just out of reach, and that's where we get our word tantalizing. And that seems to be the emptiness here that's portrayed in the sensuality and the kiss. There's no actually reaching the fruits of the sensuality. There's no actual satisfaction whatsoever. It's just the worst version of the emptiness of this inversion. So hell-like. Her name is Hela, and this is a hell-like situation where this is a fitting punishment. Not necessarily for Veronica, but you could see how this would very much be a fitting punishment. This is something you could easily see being similar to a punishment that Dante would come up with for someone in his Inferno, because he comes up with creative punishments for particular sins, and you could see how this could fit something like that.
Yeah, I think it's especially tough because it's not even pleasing. Not only does it not satisfy, it also doesn't please.
Right. I don't know. I think that's a good spot to stop on this chapter. I mean, probably also this part of our discussion as well. We've been going for a little while. Joel, do you have anything else here on this chapter?
No, I think this is great. This is awesome. This is episode 2 for The Master and Margarita. We've been the Deep Dive Book Club podcast. I've been Joel.
This is Leo, and on the scary vampire note, we will end our conversation here, and we hope that you, dear listener, don't run into any crazy supernatural creatures in the night.
And if you do, you should see the show notes for how to contact us and tell us about it. Tell you what, you send us that, we'll read it on air.
Right, exactly. All right. Well, with that, friends, we will talk to you next time when we continue our conversation on The Master and Margarita.
All right, see you next week.